Good morning and Shabbat Shalom and welcome. This is VBS Torah Study for a Shabbos morning. We are joined this morning by Rabbi Sherre Hirsch of the American Jewish University and Rabbi Marc Gellman of Florida. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein of VBS, and we are certainly delighted to have you here. This week, we open to the second Torah portion in the book of Genesis, the story of Noah. The story of Genesis is a story in three acts, a drama in three acts. Last week, we create the world, and we're introduced to a God who is creator, a God who has the power to create reality and the power to dream. And it is God's dream to bring a creature into the world who will share God's dreams and share the responsibility for creating and protecting the world. And that creature is the human being. But the human being is given one endowment, which is troublesome and difficult, but critical. It is the endowment of freedom, the ability to make choices. And right away, human beings begin choosing away from the ways of God, get thrown out of the Garden of Eden in the second chapter. We have the death of Abel at the hands of Cain in the next chapter. A world fills with violence. And by the end of last week's Torah portion, the world has filled with violence. And God regrets having created the world. Have you ever done any cooking or any baking? Sometimes you screw it up. I do, certainly. You mistake the salt for the sugar. You forget to put the yeast in the bread. And what ends up happening is something so ferocious, so horrible, that you decide the only thing to do is to bury it at the bottom of the garbage can and tell everyone you're going out to the bakery to get some dessert. And that's what you do. The creation is so disappointing that you wipe away the whole thing. God says, I'm going to wipe away the whole thing. And just before God is about to wipe away the whole thing, God notices one human being. His name is Noah. Noah ish tzaddik haya tamim b'dorotav. Noah was an ish tzaddik. He was a righteous man. He was righteous in his generation. He was tam. He was pure in his moral intentions and moral actions. And God decides to start again with him. I couldn't create a human being to share my dreams of a world of oneness, a world of harmony, a world of peace, a world of life. Perhaps I can choose one who has constitutional ability to become the kind of human being that God dreams to be, and that's Noah. And the world is wiped out with a flood, and Noah begins a world again. And that's this week's Torah portion. Now, what's remarkable is to notice what has changed between last week and this week. Sherre, talk to us about the character of God in this story.
So that was a beautiful opening, Eddie. Thank you. I am taken in this story with the evolution of God. God creates this world with total optimism and high hopes. And it's like, I've created this world. We just finished last week and it's fabulous. And then the people misbehave and you see God sort of like, oh my God, I'm in shock. What happened here, right? It's almost like the first time your perfect child misbehaves, you're like, what? I didn't plan for that. And then God's immediate reaction is, that's it. I'm going to destroy everything. It's done. Start again. And there's a really reactionary response by God. It's very almost childlike, right? It's like, I'm taking my toys and I'm going to put you on a boat and everybody else. I mean, it's a very juvenile response. But then when God creates the world anew, God makes a promise, which we can debate who the promise is to, but God makes a promise that he'll never react in the same way again. He will never destroy the world again. And I think what's fascinating is to look at what God learned about God's self. So God's immediate thought was, I'm going to create a perfect world and it's going to be perfect and everything's going to go just like I planned. It didn't happen. I threw a tantrum. But then when I recreated a new world, I met it with much more realism. And I promised myself that I wouldn't destroy it again. So there's this evolution of God going from sort of a idealist to a realist, but even more so having a recognition of oh, it's not going to turn out the way I always thought it would turn out. And in order to give out free will, I'm going to have to let go of some control. And I think that evolution mirrors the same evolution that we have in our own lives, right? Like we think we have total ultimate control to run everything. And the minute it doesn't go as we planned, we realize it's because other people have plans, ideas, thoughts, ideas, and we have to adjust. And we can't just throw a tantrum every time and be like, I'm taking my toys and I'm leaving and I'm destroying the world and I'm not going to play with you. But I think that seeing God in that way is a very powerful way to see God and allows us the ability to relate to God more as not just the omniscient, all-powerful other being, but somebody or something that's very much in process.
You know, Sherre, forgive me for always raising this issue, but you're the one among us who's actively raising children at the moment. So I remember when our kids were coming into the world, we took a class on, you know, getting ready to be parents. And the theory that they presented was that parenting is a dialectic. It is a tension between parental expectations and the child's sort of essential being. And you have to have both. Parents without expectations don't do kids any favor, but parents whose expectations crush the kid's freedom is no good either. And the kid has to have their own being, their own inner soul development, but they also react against parental expectations. And there's always a tension here. And you raise this as an issue because it's such an interesting metaphor that what this parsha gives us is a parenting metaphor for God. That this is what raising children is like, coping with their freedom, their being, their individuality, and our hopes and our aspirations and our freedoms, right?
And I have to make a disclaimer. Of course, I'm reading the Torah right now like that because I'm deep in the conversation of raising teenagers, which is finding that balance and that tension between freedom and independence and control and expectations. So what I think is so fascinating always about reading the Torah is I couldn't have given this response 10 years ago because I had little children, right? So every time we come to this parsha anew, we come to this Torah anew, and we've changed and the words speak to us entirely differently. So I have to remind people of that because this reading is very much because I'm deep in it. And for all the parents that are raising teenagers out there, just take a deep breath because that's what I'm doing on a daily basis.
And how many times would you like to put your teenagers on a boat and leave them in the middle of the ocean for a couple of weeks?
Not only that, I'd like to put them on a boat that God put Noah on with no sanitary, no bathroom, lots of smelly animals. Like I want them to suffer.
So it was, my kid's room was like that. It was. Marc,
I can't say that in my kid's house. I think I'd be killed, but it's better than that.
Marc, so Sherre presents us with a parental metaphor of this parsha, and it raises a whole bunch of theological issues. So talk to us about the theology of Noah.
Yeah, it's a wonderful metaphor if God was a person. Unfortunately, God isn't a person. So that metaphor breaks down. And what we expect from God, we don't expect from people because God has no material essence. And because God doesn't have a material being, God doesn't have the sins that come from being a material being, which is the source of our sin. That's why we make bad choices. So the metaphor breaks down because we expect more from God. And the Greeks were the ones who understood this. They understood that God had to be perfect or God wasn't God. Why? God couldn't be anything other than the most perfect imaginable being. In Aristotle's phrase, noesis noiosis, thought thinking itself. Now, what happened was the Greeks completely changed our way of looking at the Torah, which is a pre-philosophical work. In the Torah, as you and Sherre both beautifully described, God is like a parent. And the idea that God is all-knowing is simply alien to the Torah. God has all sorts of, it's called anthropopathism, human emotions. This is God was regretted. How can God regret something if you're all-knowing? He regretted that God made the world, or God was angry. These are not divine qualities for a Greek-oriented God, who for the last 3,000 years, 2,500 years, has been basically the way we've understood God. So the first problem we have is, how do we reconcile whatever we think about God now, which has got to be more sophisticated than the Torah, and has to be more human than the Greeks? How do we find a way of understanding God that explains the flood? And I think the answer is that God completely understood from the beginning that the one gift that God would give us, which was Tselem Elohim, to be made in God's image, which means to have freedom of the will, to have freedom of choice. That one gift was, and the mystics finally got a metaphor for it, which was tzimtzum. It meant that God was shrinking up. That's their understanding of the actual cosmogonic act, that God shrunk up and then exploded, and on and on. It goes on. But basically, God has to shrink God's presence in a world that is populated by free beings. And that means that God cannot know what we will choose next. Can't know. Because if God knows, then we're actually fated to choose it. God knows what we will do, that we'll do X. We're really not, are we really free to do Y if God knows we're going to do X? No, because it's a kind of a fate. And for the Greeks, this was not a problem. Fate was a real issue. Freedom was illusory. And things kept repeating the way they were, at least that's Aristotle's thought. So the idea of God that harmonizes the Torah and the Greeks was ultimately the goal of primarily the Weimar and school. It was primarily Rosenzweig's life work. I mean, Hermann Cohen also was interested in it, but it was his idea, Rosenzweig's idea, that basically God operates on a different level of existence, and that we can't reach that existence, but that there are penetrations of that existence into our existence. That those penetrations are moments when divinely inspired beings, human beings, angels, others, reach into our world and give us the Torah, give us the way. And so what we have is God realizing in the flood that humanity had made so many bad choices that it had to be destroyed. But afterwards, there is a complete awareness by God, who is all-knowing, of what that defect was in the first creation. And it was Yetzer Lev Ha'adam Ra Minu Ra. The inclination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Now, Christianity takes that same point, develops the same idea with a little, obviously, Christological overtones, and they develop it into original sin. Most people I know, most serious Jewish thinkers, have lived their Jewish life thinking that we have no similarity to Christianity, and that is not true. Our idea and their idea was that we have an evil impulse in us, which is the result of the fact that we're partly animals and partly divine. And some philosophers, like Thomas Hobbes, took the position that our animal nature is so dominant that our divine nature is irrelevant. He says, homo hominis lupus, is Hobbes' theory, which is Each person is the wolf of their neighbor. That's what we're really like. And I often ask people at the early stages of theology classes, I ask them, what do you think is true? And I ask you, my teachers, my friends, what do you think is true? Are we basically the wolves of our neighbors? Or are we basically made in the image of God to do good? Now, I know both are true, and I know there's evidence for both. That's not my question. My question to you, my beloved friends, is this: which is more true for you?
Sherre, you want to answer the question?
No, I think you should answer first, because I'm just sitting here sort of taking it all in.
I think they're both true, Marc. I don't think you can separate them. And I think Genesis.
They are both true. The
I-
question
but-
is, which is more true?
No, but that's not fair. I think that Genesis knew this, which is why you have two stories of creation. In the first story, the human being is created b'tselem Elokim, in the image of God, to shine with divinity. And in the second story, we're created afar me'efer, we're dust of the earth, basically walking schmutz.
Yeah.
I think that is the moral spectrum upon which human beings live. Now, if you ask me which, it sort of depends on what time of day you ask me, because when I open up my newspaper in the morning, I see human beings as deeply corrupt and as deeply and as ridiculously foolish in the morning. That's what my morning newspaper is all about. But over the course of the day, I meet people, you and Sherre happen to be among them, who convince me that there are still moral possibilities, that moral aspirations are possible. And some days I'm lucky enough that by the time supper rolls around, I'm in a pretty good mood. I'm in a pretty good sense that human beings just might have the capacity to redeem the world. And that's my daily journey. And I don't think I sort of think that's sort of where the Jewish tradition puts me, in a moral spectrum, in a moral dialectic that acknowledges both things as true. Let me turn a question back to you, though. So freedom is the question of this Torah portion, because the problem that God is wrestling with in the mythical language of the Torah portion, not in the Greek philosophical language, but in the mythical language, the question is freedom. The freedom to make choices, including bad choices. And what's interesting about this story then is including the capacity to actually destroy God's world. And the question is it better for us to have that freedom and to continue to make these choices, even if we make the bad choices? God promises at the end of the Parsha never to do this again, but he doesn't promise that we won't do it again. And later on in the book of Yirmiyahu, as you remember, Jeremiah comes to a point, and Ezekiel agrees with him a little bit later. Maybe it'd be better if God took away freedom and simply wrote the Torah into the heart of human beings so that we would become automatically tzaddikim instead of chosen tzaddikim. In a certain way, Thomas Hobbes, your friend, Thomas Hobbes offered the same thing. We need a Leviathan. We need a ruler who will keep order in the world and will give up our freedom to the Leviathan, to the tyrant, because the tyrant will keep us from killing each other. There's any number of science fiction movies, and in fact, Yuval Harari, the historian who writes futurism, has been writing about this, that artificial intelligence is going to take over the planet and prevent us from killing each other because we can't live with freedom. So here's the question. At the end of this Torah portion, can we live with freedom, or are human beings incapable of having that prerogative?
Well, I'd like to have Sherre have an opportunity to respond, and then I will answer your question.
Oh.
Well, answer, and then I'll respond to the both of you.
Okay. So the answer, in fact, it's in this week's column I wrote for Tribune. And if you want to read them, just Google God Squad articles by Marc Gellman, and you'll see my last 6 columns. But the answer is Leibniz. You have to read the philosopher Leibniz, who made the argument at great length that this is the best of all possible worlds. even with all the evil that's in it. And his argument is essentially that without free will, we are unable to act in any moral way. Bees, which all work in harmony, aren't acting with a moral consciousness that this is good for the hive. This is just what's in their DNA. In order to act morally, you have to have freedom of will and choice. I would add to Leibniz's brilliant defense of the world as it is, as the best of all possible worlds, even a world with Auschwitz in it. I would add to that without freedom of the will, we are incapable of loving. And the test that I offer is, in my bar mitzvah class, I would always do what they called Rabbi Gellman's 2 tough questions. I'd ask them questions that were so hard no one could answer. One of them was, you have a crush on someone, and these were 13-year-olds, so right? They're in the middle of hormones, and you have a crush on someone in school and they think you're dirt. But all of a sudden, a fairy, Tinkerbell, puts a little vial of love potion number 9 on your sideboard, and they say, if you put this in their juice box or in their Coke, and they drink it, they'll love you. And so the question is, would you spike their juice box with love potion number 9, knowing that their love for you was chemically induced and wasn't authentic? And all the girls in my class, all of them said, no, we would never do the love potion number 9. And all the boys, after the girls said that, because they want the girls, said, oh yeah, we wouldn't either. One guy in 40 years, one 13-year-old courageous boy said, yeah, absolutely. I'd give her the love potion number 9. So I said, Matthew, see me after class. So after class, Matthew comes over, sits down. I said, Matthew, you know it's wrong to do the love potion number 9. Why would you give it to her? And he looked at me and said, Rabbi, do you remember what it was like to be a 13-year-old boy? And that, I said, Nitzchuni banai. This was the moment when my students defeated me. So it was the perfect response, because what he's saying is, yes, I know it's wrong, but I'm an animal, and I have animal lusts, and I have animal needs. And if this love potion is going to help me satisfy those animal needs, I'm going to use it. So the 2 answers: you need freedom of the will in order to choose the moral good, and you need freedom of the will in order to love.
Well, if I put it in a slightly different idiom, to go back to the conversation we had before with Sherre, is, have you ever said to your kids, because I'm your mother, that's why, or I'm your father? Have you ever exerted authority over a child because you just didn't want to deal with their freedom, and you knew what you wanted done, and you knew that what you wanted done was the right thing? I mean, so the question really is, respecting the freedom of the other, to what extent, are we able to live with that? That's what this Torah portion is really about.
So I think, Eddie, you're asking such an important question, because I don't think it's about should we have freedom of will or should we not. It's to what degree have we been given freedom of will? Now I'm saying freedom of will when I'm saying free will. To what degree have we been given free will? Is it yoter midai? Is it too much? What if God, we're always thinking about it, should we have free will or should we not have free will? Maybe there should be limits on our free will, which is a very uncomfortable thing to say, because we live in freedom and we feel like nobody can tell me what limit should be on my free will. But if we were initially started and created with certain limits on our free will, not to kill another human being at our own will, like all those different things, maybe we would see it differently. So I don't think it's a question of should we have free will or should we not have free will. It's what should we have free will about? And I know some people out there are going to be super unhappy with me, but we have to entertain that conversation, as it's uncomfortable as it is.
Not me. I'm a free will guy. And in fact, there was just a piece in the Times about parenting styles, and the authoritative parenting style, just because I say so, does not work. And the permissive parenting style, it's your life, do what you want, that does not work. What they discovered works is this dialogue of let's talk about what you want to do, why you want to do it, and what's going to make you happy in the long run.
But what if before we were created, God created us in mind with that we had certain limits on our free will? It wasn't all or nothing. What you're saying is exactly what I'm saying. Mark, you're saying is you have to negotiate what part of free will you're going to use and what part you aren't, right? What part are you going to follow? And what I'm saying is, what if we were by creation a person that had certain limits on our free will?
Then it wouldn't make any sense to have free will. It wouldn't.
No, because you think it's either all or nothing. You're such a
An
reformer.
unintelligible conversation. We would say, you want me to do what? I don't even
No, we
understand.
would say you have certain limits. You have certain things that are free will and certain things that have limits on your free will. We just don't entertain that construct because it's too daunting.
But free will isn't something you can parse. It's not something that you can parcel out in small chunks. Because
what if we didn't have the free will to kill people out of hate? What if that was built into the system that we couldn't kill someone just because we hate them? What if that was built into the fabric of our DNA?
Then that would mean that we wouldn't be choosing not to kill them. It would mean
that's what I'm saying.
Okay.
I'm saying some parts of us would be with free will, and I think God gave us too much free will. What if there was you in your DNA, you could not kill people because of just hating them?
But it doesn't work, because then you come to the Ve'ahavta, my point about love, and you say, listen, God, I'm choosing not to love you. And God said, whoa, time out. I didn't mean to include that. I'm not including that in the free will. I want you to choose. I want you to have free will to love me. No.
You're thinking all or nothing. I'm saying, what if there are certain things of which we weren't given free will? And maybe God did give us the free will to love God, but God didn't give us the free will to automatically kill someone just because we don't like them.
It's a contradiction in terms. It's like having a married bachelor or a square circle. Free will
you think free will is all or nothing.
No, free will means you have the freedom to choose. You can't have partial freedom to choose.
We're in the middle of this conversation now. Just open the newspaper. If you mandate vaccination for public life in this country, you are saying to people, we respect your liberty in all sorts of areas, but in certain areas, in order to participate in the collective life of our society, you're going to have to do something that you may not want to do. And there's a huge debate going on about what are the limits of liberty and what are the requirements of collective life. And it's a very interesting conversation, because just as the two of you have just shown, there isn't a lot of middle ground here.
No middle ground.
Correct.
But that's we're still choosing a government which we give freely, give of our autonomy to the government to make certain decisions, like which side of the road we're going to drive on, what the speed limits are, whether you need to be vaccinated, the laws. And that's how the state of nature produces civil society.
Right.
But it doesn't produce civil society because it's imposed. Take a look at what happens in all imposed societies. The communist society does not work. These don't work because it's an inconceivability to say to people, well, you have a choice. You can love the grand ruler and the state, or we kill you. That's not a choice. You either have freedom or you don't. And the reason America is what it is.
Marc Gellman, freedom fighter. I love this.
Right. I just want to say, Mark, there's an element to what is the construct, and then there's the tactical, right? The construct is maybe you can't have free will to kill another person. New York has no problem telling me I have to be vaccinated in order to walk in and participate in the collective of New York life. No problem. But then there's the tactical, what you're saying, look at communism, it didn't work. Look at this. I understand that. But what I'm saying is maybe at the onset, we were given too much free will on certain issues. Because let me tell you, yesterday I was crossing the street. Someone was crossing the street and a guy, whatever, cut him off. I was just a witness. And they started screaming at each other the most horrid things. And then the guy tried to hit him again. And I was like, okay, too much free will, right? We have way too much free will in this thing. Like, you're not allowed to speak to another human being like that. You're on mute. You're on mute. Eddie, you're on mute too.
Yeah, they're
When
good.
someone invades your country, you can't defend your country by killing them. When someone's out to kill your family, you can't defend yourself and your family by killing them before they kill you. The Torah
What
says,
about Squirrel
the
Hill?
Talmud says,
Someone walking
"Hashkem
into a synagogue and
lahargacha,
shooting up people.
Hashkem
Guys,
lahargo."
guys, hang on. Okay. What I'd like to do for a moment before we conclude is I want to present a different perspective on the story. One of the ways to read a Bible story isn't simply from the outside, which is the narrator's point of view, but to read it from the inside. And for just a moment, let's read the story of Noah from Noah's point of view. And let's begin with creation. Last week, when we talked about creation, you remember that in the very first words of Genesis, the Ruach Elohim merachefet al pnei hamayim, that God's spirit hovers over the water. Water is the Bible's symbol for primordial chaos. It's uncreated stuff, uncreated world. And what happens on the second day of creation is that the water is split. And remember how the Bible describes it. There's water below, and there's water above, and there's a firmament. A firmament means a space, an open space. And the world of dry land, the world of inhabitable universe, is inserted in the space between the water above and the water below. And that's where we live. Now, for a moment, consider that metaphor, as it were. That means there's an ocean of chaos right above your head. And there's an ocean of chaos right beneath your feet. And you live, we live, all of us try to make a life, try to make a living, try to make a home in this little tiny space that God has created in the midst of an ocean of chaos, an ocean of uncreated violence, mushmash chaos. And what happens in the story of Noah is that God basically opens up the tap, and the chaos from above and the chaos from below floods into our world and whoosh, washes away all that is created. Now, for just a moment, I want you to be Noah, and I want you to stand on the bridge of the ark, and I want you to watch this. And I want you to imagine what it's like to watch the chaos above falling into the world and the chaos from below bubbling up from underneath. And imagine watching everything that's in the world, everything that's alive, just washed away by all of that. And when I was a little kid, I grew up in the 60s during what was called the Cold War. And I remember, and I lived in Canoga Park. And one of the things about Canoga Park, my neighborhood, was that that's where all of America's rockets and missiles were built. North American Rockwell and Rocketdyne and Hughes and Litton and Atomics International and all of the defense contractors were in my neighborhood, because all the kids in my class, with a few exceptions, their dads were engineers in those businesses, in those places. And I remember we used to have a thing called the drop drill, where the teacher would shout out the word drop, and it was our responsibility to get down under our desk. And thank God I was young and naive and foolish and actually believed that my half-inch plywood desk with the Formica top would protect me from hundreds of tons of Russian megadeth, because that's what they told us. We had a little film strip. There were film strips once upon that showed us what happens in a nuclear attack, and that we believed that our desks would protect us. We grew up in that time. Grew up in a time when Cold War, we anticipated that someday we would look up and see death falling from the sky. In a certain way, I remember those nightmares as a little kid, because they began to get to me. And I wonder, looking at from Noah's point of view at a world destroyed by this influx of chaos, what that does to a human soul, what that does to a human civilization. What kind of twists and turns it imposes upon a life when you have to see everything that you've seen in the world washed away by the chaos of instability. And then coming out of that ark on that blessed day with this rainbow in the sky and the animals leaving the ark, and imagining that it's your responsibility to start over again. That image of him standing on the deck of the boat, of the ark, watching all of that, sticks with me tremendously. And it explains, in a certain sense, for those of you who are frustrated with boomers, my generation, just understand that's how we grew up. That's the world that we grew up in. Right? Some of us were alive during the Cuban Missile Crisis, or alive during and we're waiting for those words. We're waiting for that chaos, and the chaos that attacks the society at those moments. Well, I want to finish today. There's a couple of wonderful stories that are attached, and one of the ones I cherish the most that I tell to kids is a beautiful little midrash that occurs in the tradition. It says Noah, was on the boat, and the boat the ark was floating on the waves, and his sons come to him and they said, "Pop, you got to come right away. The lion is about to eat the sheep." So Noah runs down to the fourth deck to the lion's room, and there he is sitting at a table with a bib wrapped around his and a knife and a fork and a bottle of steak sauce, and there's this poor Nebuch, this poor frightened sheep on the plate. And Noah says, "You got to stop. You can't eat that. I don't have that many of them. And if you eat it, there won't be any more left in the world." And the lion says, "But I'm a carnivore. You got to let me eat what I eat." And Noah says, "Listen, I know that you're a carnivore, but for the purposes of this voyage, I need you to suppress that part of your nature. You can't kill. You have to make good." And the lion says, "What am I supposed to eat?" Noah says, "I don't know, tofu, And the lion says, "Okay, for you, I will eat tofu." And then the next one is the elephants are frolicking and playing. And Noah goes to the elephants and says, "You have to stop. You'll capsize us." And they said, "But that's our nature. We frolic, we play." Well, for the purposes of the voyage, you have to suppress that part of your nature. And then it was, of course, the monkeys who were stealing everyone's food, and the mosquitoes who were stinging everyone. And by the time the voyage had ended, Noah had gone to each one of the creatures and begged them to suppress one part of their nature in order that we might survive the journey. And the story ends with a simple question: and what of our natures do we have to learn to control if we're to survive the journey that we all share in this world? I want to thank my teachers, Rabbi Gellman and Rabbi Hirsch, for a wonderful conversation about free will. I want to warn everyone to use your free will with great, great care this week, because the world is fraught and dangerous. And whether we accept the metaphor or not, if you look above, there's chaos. If you look below, there's chaos. If you open the newspaper, there's chaos. So please take care of yourselves. We wish you a very, very good Shabbos. Rabbis, thank you so much for joining us.
Good Shabbos.
Shabbat shalom.